Before we dive in, drop a quick hi in the comments. It may seem small, but trust me, it really helps YouTube share this story with more sci-fi fans like us. I'd love to see who's watching.
Contacts. Dunaj didn't look up from the scope when he said it. 4 signatures, Vreth configuration, coming in from the trailing quarter. Lieutenant Commander Ren Halko felt his jaw tighten. Distance, 18,000 clicks and closing. A pause. They're not in a hurry. No. They never were. That was the thing about the Vreth. They moved like they had already won, and were just waiting for everyone else to notice. They're merging with the convoy, Dunaj said. His voice was flat, professional. But his hand gripped the edge of his console. 2 destroyers and a Lance cruiser tucking into the center spread. 4th contact holding at the rear, carrier class. Halko pulled up the formation overlay. Blue dots for civilian ships, red dots for Vreth. The red settled into the blue like blood into water. The convoy stretched across 400 kilometers of open space, a ragged line of freighters and passenger haulers crawling toward the inner worlds. 17 ships, 9,000 souls. Families from the border colonies packed into cargo holds with whatever they could carry. 4 months since the Vreth Dominion had crossed the border, a dispute over mineral rights in the outer systems. That was how it started. That was what the diplomats called it, while the Vreth burned through 4 colony worlds and pushed millions of civilians toward the inner systems. 12 human worlds reduced to 8. The refugees kept coming. Halko watched it all from the tactical display aboard the UTDF corvette Ashburn. 2 escort corvettes for 17 civilian ships. That was what the fleet could spare. That was what 9,000 lives were worth on the current ledger. Halko had seen the tactic before. The Vreth would approach, match speed, and slide their warships directly into the convoy formation. Between the freighters. Behind the passenger liners. Close enough that their engine wash rattled civilian hulls. Weapons, Halko said. Do we have solutions? I have locks on all 4, Lieutenant Caro said from the weapons board. Clear firing lanes on the carrier. The 3 inside the convoy, negative. Every lane crosses a civilian hull. And there it was. The geometry of the trap. The Vreth knew the accord of non-combatants better than the species that wrote it. Article 9. No military action shall be initiated where civilian casualties are a foreseeable outcome. The penalty was fleet seizure, territorial forfeiture, and permanent trade embargo. Every spacefaring species had signed it. Every species respected it. The Vreth didn't break the accord. They just stood behind it and dared anyone to shoot through it. Technically, they weren't targeting civilians. They were occupying adjacent space, a legal gray zone wide enough to fly a dreadnought through. The Galactic Arbitration Council had reviewed the tactic twice already. Both times the ruling came back the same. No violation. The Vreth were not using civilians as shields. They were simply exercising freedom of navigation in a shared corridor. Halko had read that ruling many times, looking for something he could use. There was nothing. Corvette Ashburn. The voice came over the fleet channel. Captain Morath of the escort corvette Drava. I see them. Same playbook. Same playbook, Halko confirmed. Rules of engagement? Unchanged. Do not fire into the convoy spread. Do not provoke. Maintain escort posture. A pause. Then Morath said quietly, Copy. The Vreth settled in. Their destroyers drifted between freighters like predators, swimming through a school of fish. The Lance cruiser, the real threat, the ship that could gut an escort corvette from stem to stern, positioned itself directly behind the passenger liner Korova. 1,400 people on that ship. Families. The Vreth cruiser's plasma lances were powered up and aimed forward, using the Korova's bulk as a screen. Halko watched the display and did nothing. because there was nothing to do. For 6 hours, the convoy crawled forward with Vreth warships nested inside it like parasites. The civilian captains sent tight beam messages to the Ashburn, frightened, angry, asking why the escorts weren't doing anything. Halko had no answer that would make sense to a cargo pilot with 300 refugees in his hold and a Vreth destroyer close enough to scrape paint off his hull. Then the Vreth opened fire. It happened fast. The Lance cruiser behind the Korova fired its main battery, not at the convoy, but at a UTDF patrol group that had entered the corridor 12,000 clicks ahead. 2 patrol frigates running a standard sweep. The plasma lances reached out from inside the convoy formation like arms through a crowd, threading between civilian hulls. "Contact! Vreth weapons free!" Dunaj's voice cracked. "They're engaging the patrol group from inside the spread." Halko saw it on the display. The patrol frigates were taking fire. One was already venting atmosphere. The Vreth destroyers inside the convoy opened up a second later. Secondary batteries, targeted and precise, cutting across the civilian formation to hit military targets on the far side. "Weapons, can you return fire?" Caro's hands were moving across her board. "Negative, negative. Every solution crosses civilian shipping. I can't get a clean lane." "Drava, this is Ashburn. Are you clean?" "Morath, negative. I've got the freighter Oban directly between me and the nearest destroyer. If I miss by 10 meters, I kill 400 people." The Vreth kept firing. They didn't need to move. They didn't need to maneuver. They sat inside the convoy like hunters in a blind and shot at everything that wore a uniform while surrounded by everything that didn't. Then the geometry shifted. One of the Vreth destroyers adjusted its firing angle. A small correction, maybe 2 degrees. The plasma lance that had been threading between the freighter's Gask and Palova caught the edge of the Palova's engine housing. The beam punched through the hull like a fist through wet paper. The Palova broke apart in 4 seconds. Her reactor containment failed, and the blast wave hit the ships on either side. The freighter Den, loaded with refugees from the Kessler colony, took the shockwave broadside. Her hull buckled. Atmosphere vented from 6 decks simultaneously. Then the passenger liner Korova, the big one, the one with 1,400 aboard, caught a stray lance that cored through her midsection. The ship folded. Internal bulkheads collapsed in sequence. Emergency beacons fired in a cascade, dozens of them, bright and useless against the dark. 2,400 people died in the Marin 4 corridor in under 4 minutes. But the Vreth did not stop firing. Their lances continued to reach through the shattered convoy toward the patrol frigates beyond. The beams crossed the civilian formation again and again, while the ships scattered and collided, drives failing, hulls rupturing as debris and shockwaves tore through the line. Halko stood at his display and watched the blue dots begin to vanish. 1, 3, 7, 12. Some blinked out all at once. Others faded slowly as hulls ruptured and reactors died. Each one a ship, each ship a city, each city gone. The Vreth ceased fire 90 seconds after the patrol frigates were destroyed. Mission complete. They pulled out of the convoy formation at standard cruise speed, unhurried, and rejoined their carrier at the rear. No communication. No acknowledgement of what had just happened. The corridor was silent, except for distress beacons. Ashburn to all convoy ships. Halko's voice was steady. He made it steady. Begin search and rescue. All hands. There was almost no one to rescue. The GAC observer arrived 11 days later. Divan of the Tessari moved through the debris field in a survey shuttle, documenting. The Tessari were considered ideal neutral observers. Their translucent skin displayed their emotions in bioluminescent patterns that couldn't be faked, which made them trusted arbiters. Divan's skin was cycling through deep blues and grays as the shuttle drifted past the wreckage of the Korova. Frozen bodies, hundreds of them. tumbling slowly in the vacuum, arms outstretched, mouths open. Some were small. Devan noted that in his report with clinical precision, because the report required clinical precision, and then he turned away from the viewport and pressed his long fingers against his face until the bioluminescence under his skin stopped flickering. He documented the blast patterns. He analyzed the Vreth firing trajectories. He cross-referenced the convoy's registered flight plan with the Vreth fleet's recorded positions. All of it pointed to the same conclusion. The Vreth had fired on military targets from within a civilian formation, and the civilian deaths were a direct, foreseeable consequence of that choice. He submitted his findings to the Galactic Arbitration Council with a recommendation for immediate sanctions under Article 9. The ruling came back in 6 days. Formal concern: no sanctions, no fleet restrictions, no territorial penalty. The Council determined that the Vreth had engaged legitimate military targets and that civilian casualties, while regrettable, fell within the accepted parameters of collateral damage during lawful combat operations. The Vreth had not targeted civilians. The Vreth had not intended civilian casualties. The corridor geometry was unfortunate. Unfortunate. That was the word they used for 9,000 dead. Devan read the ruling in his quarters aboard the observation station. His skin went completely dark, no color at all, which in Tasari physiology meant something had gone so far past emotion that the body simply shut down its display. He sat in the dark for a long time. He forwarded the ruling to Lieutenant Commander Halko as a matter of protocol. Halko read it on the bridge of the Ashburn while his crew worked around him. He set down the datapad. He looked at the main display, where the convoy route through Marin 4 was still plotted, still marked with the locations where ships had died. He didn't say anything. He didn't break anything. He didn't make a speech. He just stood there, and something behind his eyes went quiet in a way that his crew noticed and never mentioned. The ruling was also broadcast on public channels, as all GAC decisions were. Standard transparency protocol. All refugee camps, any surviving convoy, each civilian station in human space received it. Tomasz Brodzik heard the ruling on the cargo deck of his freighter, the Maser, docked at resettlement station, Corinth. He was 46, hands like knotted rope from 20 years of dock work and freight hauling. He'd been born on Marin 4, worked the ore run since he was 19, and knew every ship in the convoy by name and registration number. His brother Piotr had been on the Den. Piotr and his son Marek, 14 years old. The boy had wanted to be an engineer. He'd been accepted to a technical school on the inner worlds. That was why they were on the convoy, to get the boy to school. Tomasz had gone out on a rescue hauler the day after the massacre. He'd found the Den, or what was left of it. A shattered hull tumbling end over end, open to vacuum, every deck exposed. He'd walked through it in a pressure suit, stepping over frozen debris and frozen people, looking for his brother. He found Piotr's jacket. Nothing else. Now he stood on the cargo deck of the Maser and listened to the GAC ruling and felt nothing at all, which was worse than feeling everything, because it meant something fundamental had disconnected and was not coming back. He looked around the cargo hold, empty. The Maser was a bulk hauler, big, slow, built to carry mining ore and industrial equipment. Cavernous hold, reinforced frame, rated for volatile cargo. Tomasz picked up a cutting torch and started working. He cut out the interior cargo bracing. He pulled the passenger rigging that he'd installed for refugees. He stripped the hold down to bare metal and structural frame. He didn't talk to anyone. He didn't explain what he was doing. But other dock workers saw him through the open cargo bay, and a few of them stopped and watched. And then one of them picked up a welding rig and walked aboard without asking. By the end of the day, 4 people were working on the maser. By the next morning, 11. They brought scrap metal from the station's recycling yards, industrial fertilizer from the agricultural stores, compressed gas canisters from the mining supply depot, ball bearings, bolts, chain links, anything dense, anything sharp, anything that would become lethal when propelled by a blast wave. Nobody called it a weapon. Nobody said the word out loud. But everyone on that dock knew what a cargo hold full of shrapnel and mining explosives was for. And the MASSACRE wasn't the only ship. Across the refugee network, on stations and colony worlds, and in the holds of drifting freighters, the same thing was happening. No orders, no organization, no chain of command. Civilian communications channels, the old merchant shorthand that freight haulers used to coordinate docking and cargo transfers, started carrying new traffic, coded, fragmented, discussing tonnage and yield and optimal dispersal patterns. Ren Halko picked up the chatter on the Ashburn's communication array during a routine sweep. He sat with his headset on for a long time, listening to freight haulers and dock workers and refugee camp supervisors talk in half sentences about things that had nothing to do with cargo. He recorded it. Standard protocol required him to flag it and forward it to UTDF intelligence. He deleted the recording. He tuned the Ashburn's comms to a different frequency and never mentioned it to anyone. On the Vreth command vessel Symmetry of Purpose, Ordinator Savul Tit reviewed the Marin 4 after-action report with satisfaction. His 4 upper limbs arranged data crystals on the planning surface while his lower arms remained folded, a posture of intellectual ease. The faceted eyes processed the tactical overlay in ultraviolet shifted detail that human eyes would never see. The engagement had been textbook. 2 human patrol frigates destroyed. Fleet losses, 0. The civilian casualties were noted in the report as an environmental variable, listed under terrain effects, the same category as asteroid interference or solar radiation. Savul Tet's aide, a second-caste logistics officer, flagged an anomaly in human-civilian traffic patterns. Several freighters registered as bulk haulers had altered their cargo manifests in the past week. Supply transfers at refugee stations had increased. The aide suggested further monitoring. Savul Thet clicked dismissively, a sharp, descending harmonic that his translator didn't bother to convert because the contempt was universal. Resource-adjacent fauna, he said. Displacement behavior. They hoard supplies when frightened. It is documented in their species profile. He returned to planning the next fleet advance. The inner human worlds were within reach. 3 more months and the campaign would be complete. The humans had no fleet capable of stopping him, and their own laws prevented them from engaging his ships in any formation that mattered. The war was already won. The rest was just geometry. He did not look at the civilian traffic data again. 3 weeks after the Marin 4 massacre, resettlement station Corinth smelled like chemical burn and hot metal. The ventilation systems couldn't keep up. Nobody complained. Nobody cared. Tomasz Brodzik walked the lower cargo decks of the station with a manifest in his hand. Not a cargo manifest, though it was formatted like one. Old merchant shorthand. Tonnage, yield ratios, dispersal patterns. Anyone who read it without knowing the codes would see a routine supply transfer document. Anyone who knew the codes would see a target list. The camps had changed. 3 weeks was all it took. The refugee population on Corinth alone was 40,000. Miners, engineers, freight operators, dock workers, fabricators, chemists, people who built things for a living, people who understood pressure tolerances, chemical reactions, structural failure points, people who had lost families in the Marin 4 corridor and received a GAC ruling that told them those deaths were unfortunate. They got to work. Section 9 of the lower deck had been a family housing block. Now it was a chemical processing line, household cleaning agents broken down into base compounds, and recombined into corrosive mixtures that could eat through Vreth plating in under 30 seconds. A former industrial chemist named Dahl ran the operation. He'd lost his daughter on the Korova. He didn't talk about it. He measured reagents with steady hands and filled pressurized canisters with something that had no name, but had been tested on a piece of salvaged Vreth armor plating. The chitin had dissolved like sugar in water. Section 12 was fabrication. 3D printers that had been shipped to the refugee camps for habitat construction, walls, furniture, water fixtures, now stamped out guidance fins, detonator housings, and fragmentation sleeves. The print files were shared across the civilian network in encrypted bursts disguised as entertainment media downloads. A comedy show file that was actually a blueprint for a proximity fuse. A music album that contained the schematics for a shrapnel charge optimized for vacuum detonation. Section 4 was ordnance assembly. Fertilizer from the station's agricultural base, combined with oxidizers from the mining supply depot, packed into reinforced containers with a layer of ball bearings, chain links, and scrap metal bolts. Each container was the size of a shipping crate. Each one could shred a corridor or breach a hull. And the ships? Tomasz had finished the MASSACRE 2 weeks ago. The bulk hauler was now a delivery system. Her cargo hold was packed with compressed hydrogen and methane canisters, surrounded by shrapnel charges. Her transponder still broadcast civilian codes. Her hull still read as a standard freight hauler on any scan. She looked like what she had always been, a tired old ore boat running between stations. She was now carrying enough volatile material to crack a station's orbital ring. The MASSACRE wasn't alone. Across the refugee network, 23 freighters had been converted. Some were bulk haulers like the MASSACRE. Some were smaller, fast courier ships packed with chemical payloads. Some were passenger liners with their holds gutted and rebuilt. All of them broadcast civilian transponder codes. All of them flew standard refugee routes. All of them were weapons. Tomasz met with 11 others in a maintenance bay on Corinth's lower ring. Not a war council. There were no ranks in the room, no uniforms, no chain of command. A dock foreman, 2 freight captains, a mining engineer, a water treatment technician, a retired cargo inspector who knew every supply route in the contested systems. They stood around a workbench covered in navigation charts and spoke in short sentences. Vreth Supply Depot, Tessana Orbit. The retired cargo inspector, a man named Gruber, tapped the chart. Fuel and munitions transfer point, 3 orbital platforms, light patrol screen, 2 corvettes, rotational. Civilian traffic in the area? Tomasz asked. Heavy. Refugee convoys pass through Tessana every 40 hours on the way to the inner worlds. Vreth patrols don't screen them. They scan for military transponders and ignore everything else. They don't check cargo? Never have. Civilians aren't combatants. Their doctrine doesn't have a category for it. Silence. Then Tomasz. Who's going? A freight captain named Vasaro raised his hand. 52. Gray beard. Bad knee. He'd hauled construction materials for 30 years. His wife had been on the Palova. My ship's loaded. I know the Tessana approach. I can drift in with the next convoy wave and break off at the terminal point. You're not coming back from this. I know what I'm not coming back from. Vasaro shook hands with the people in the room and left to prep his ship. The freighter Candria entered the Tessana system, broadcasting standard civilian transponder codes, running in the wake of a refugee convoy. She was a mid-size cargo hauler, scarred and ordinary. Vreth patrol corvettes scanned her at the system boundary. Military transponder, negative. Weapon signature, negative. Cargo manifest, mining equipment, and personal effects. The corvettes logged her and moved on. Vasaro flew the Candria alone. He'd sent his crew off at Corinth. This was a one-man job, and he'd decided that weeks ago. The ship drifted through the system on a standard freight approach, angling toward the Vreth supply depot in high orbit above Tasana's fourth moon. 3 platforms linked by docking spars, surrounded by fuel tankers and munitions barges. The heart of the Vreth supply chain for the entire forward campaign. At 1,200 kilometers, Vasaro adjusted his heading. Slight correction. Nothing that would trigger an alert on Vreth sensors. He was just a cargo ship adjusting for orbital insertion. Standard procedure. At 400 kilometers, the lead Vreth corvette hailed him. Routine check. Vasaro responded with a standard freight acknowledgement. Destination, cargo, registration number. The corvette cleared him. At 80 kilometers, Vasaro armed the detonation sequence. The Candria's hold was packed with compressed hydrogen, methane, and fluorine compounds, volatile mining gases that were legal cargo on any civilian manifest. Surrounding the gas canisters were 1,200 kilograms of scrap metal shrapnel, ball bearings, bolt heads, chain links, pieces of the den that Tomasz had pulled from the debris field and given to Vasaro without a word. At 6 kilometers, the Vreth corvette noticed the Candria wasn't decelerating. A hail went out. No response. Then another. The corvette began to turn. Vasaro sent one transmission on an open channel. Not to the Vreth, to the network. Candria, on station, for the den. The freighter hit the central supply platform at full thrust and detonated. The blast was not military-grade precision. It was industrial-grade devastation. The compressed gases ignited in a cascading fireball that consumed the central platform and blew the shrapnel cloud outward at 8 kilometers per second. The 2 adjacent platforms took the wave broadside. Fuel tankers ruptured. Munitions barges cooked off in secondary explosions that lasted for 6 minutes. The docking spars shattered. Debris fields expanded outward in every direction. When it was over, the Vreth supply depot at Tasana was gone. 3 platforms, 11 fuel tankers, 4 munitions barges, and a corvette that had been docked for resupply. All of it reduced to expanding clouds of shrapnel and gas. A civilian freighter had just destroyed a military installation. The galaxy had no idea what to call it. Ordinator Savul Thet received the Tasana report aboard the Symmetry of Purpose, and for the first time in his career, he did not immediately begin planning a response. He stood at the tactical display, all 6 limbs motionless, faceted eyes processing the damage assessment, and said nothing. His aide provided the analysis. A civilian freighter, no military transponder, no weapon signature, standard cargo manifest. It had passed through 2 patrol screens without triggering a single alert. It had destroyed a supply hub that served the entire forward campaign. How? Savultet said. Not a question, a demand. The vessel was loaded with volatile mining gases, legal civilian cargo. The detonation yield was consistent with approximately 900 cubic meters of compressed hydrogen and fluorine compounds, combined with a fragmentation payload of metallic debris. Metallic debris, scrap metal, ball bearings, industrial fasteners. Savul Thet's lower arms unfolded, an involuntary stress response that he corrected immediately. His clicking undertone shifted to a higher register that his aide recognized as agitation. One ship, the aide ventured. An anomaly, a single act of desperation. Pull the civilian traffic data for the last 20 days. The aide compiled it. Savul Thet studied the patterns. Human civilian freighters, dozens of them, moving through contested systems on refugee routes, standard cargo manifests, standard transponder codes. Any one of them could be what the Candria had been, or none of them. There was no way to tell without boarding and inspecting every single vessel, and the Vreth fleet did not have the patrol capacity to screen hundreds of civilian ships while maintaining a forward campaign. Savul Thet submitted a request to Vreth High Command, reclassify human civilians as potential combatants, authorize unrestricted screening, and, if necessary, preemptive engagement of civilian vessels in contested space. The response came in 2 days. Denied. Reclassification would constitute an admission that the Vreth campaign had provoked a civilian insurrection, a political impossibility. The Dominion's position before the GAC was that the human conflict was a conventional border war being won through superior strategy. Acknowledging that civilians were now active combatants would undermine 6 months of diplomatic framing. Savul Thet read the denial and understood that he was now fighting a war his own command structure would not let him recognize. He ordered increased patrol density around supply installations. It was the only measure available within existing doctrine. His lower caste officers implemented it slowly because rapid tactical adaptation required authorization chains that moved at the speed of bureaucracy, not war. GAC observer Divan watched the Tasana footage from his quarters on the observation station. His translucent skin was shifting through colors he couldn't control, amber to deep violet to white. Fear, grief, something he didn't have a Tasari word for. A civilian ship had destroyed a military target. The Accord had no provision for this. The entire framework assumed that civilians were passive populations to be protected, not weapon systems to be deployed. The Vreth had exploited that assumption for months. Now humanity had shattered it from the other side. Divan opened a new file, not a report for the GAC. He'd lost faith in that institution the day they'd ruled 11,000 deaths as unfortunate. This file was personal, a record. He began writing what he titled Observations on the Collapse of the Non-Combatant Doctrine. He wrote, "The Accord assumed that civilized species would maintain the boundary between soldier and citizen. It did not account for what happens when one side erases that boundary by exploitation, and the other side erases it by necessity. The Vreth made civilians into shields. Humanity made civilians into swords. The Accord is now a document describing a world that no longer exists." He saved the file and sat in the dark. The strikes continued. Over the next 2 weeks, 7 more converted freighters hit Vreth targets across 4 systems: a fuel depot over Kessler, a communications relay in the Heron Belt, a staging platform above Vreth-held Marin 4, the same system where the convoy massacre had happened. Each attack followed the same pattern: civilian freighter, standard transponder, legal cargo manifest, no military signature, drifts into range, detonates. The Vreth couldn't screen for it without boarding every civilian ship in contested space, and they didn't have the resources to do that and fight a war at the same time. The Vreth adapted the only way their doctrine allowed. They started firing on civilian ships that deviated from expected flight paths: course correction too sharp, approach vector too direct, deceleration profile inconsistent. Any anomaly became a death sentence. They killed 6 civilian freighters in 10 days. 4 of them were actual refugee ships, unarmed, carrying families. The course deviations that triggered the Vreth guns were caused by engine malfunctions, navigation errors, and a pilot who'd fallen asleep at the helm. 812 more civilians dead, not from a battle, from a flinch, and every one of those deaths created more volunteers. The dock workers on Corinth, the mining crews on Pellis Station, the fabricators on the inner colony worlds who'd thought the war was far away until they saw the footage of refugee ships burning because a Vreth gunner got nervous. People who had been sitting in camps waiting for the war to end now walked into cargo bays and asked where they could be useful. The network grew. Not because anyone recruited, because the Vreth kept providing reasons. Ren Halko, still running convoy escorts through contested space, began feeding information to the network through channels so indirect that even he couldn't trace them back to himself. Patrol schedules, Vreth fleet positions, sensor gap windows. He passed them through 3 intermediaries: a dock supervisor on Corinth, a freight dispatcher on Pellis, and a retired navigator who ran a noodle stand on the civilian concourse of Waystation 11. The information flowed from military intelligence to civilian hands without ever crossing an official channel. Halco had been tireless. He stood watches that weren't his. He read the casualty reports from every Vreth strike on civilian ships and every civilian strike on Vreth installations. Both lists were getting longer. Both lists were getting worse. He was feeding a fire. He knew it. He also knew that the fire was already burning, and the only question was whether it burned with purpose or without it. Savul Thet stood at his tactical display on the symmetry of purpose and studied the problem. Dozens of human-civilian contacts moved through contested space on his screen. Blue dots. Slow. Scattered. Any one of them could be a weapon. Most of them were genuine refugees, frightened families in cargo holds, trying to reach the inner worlds. He couldn't tell which was which. His scanning technology could detect military hardware, weapon signatures, and encrypted communications. It could not detect fertilizer bombs, compressed mining gas, or ball bearings in a cargo hold, because none of those things were weapons until the moment they were. His request for reclassification had been denied. His patrol screens were stretched thin. His supply chain was bleeding from 8 successful strikes, with no guarantee that more weren't already in transit. His lower caste officers followed protocols that had been written for a different kind of war, and the authorization to change those protocols sat in a bureaucratic queue on the Vreth homeworld, waiting for a committee of upper caste administrators who had never seen combat to make a decision. Savul Thet looked at the blue dots on his display. Resource-adjacent fauna. That was what he'd called them. Displacement behavior. That was how he'd classified their activity. He didn't use those words anymore. He didn't have new words yet. His doctrine didn't provide them. The blue dots kept moving. The signal went out at 6 o'clock station time on a Tuesday. No encryption. No military codes. Just 3 words in old merchant shorthand broadcast across the civilian network. Market day, opening. 31 ships moved within the hour. Across 6 systems, in contested space and Vreth-held territory, civilian freighters broke from convoy routes and refugee lanes and turned toward their targets. Bulk haulers, courier ships, mining shuttles, a passenger ferry that had been gutted on Pellis Station and rebuilt as a fragmentation platform, all of them broadcasting civilian transponder codes, all of them running legal cargo manifests, all of them carrying enough volatile material to crack orbital infrastructure. Tomasz Brodzik stood on the cargo deck of the MASSACRE at Waystation 11, watching the network reports come in on a handheld communicator. Names and ship registrations scrolling past. People he knew. People he'd worked beside in the cargo bays of Corinth. People who were now flying toward Vreth targets and would not be flying back. Not all of them. Some ships were rigged for remote detonation, a trick the mining engineers had figured out using autopilot systems and proximity triggers. Fly the ship to the target zone, bail out in an escape pod, let the autopilot do the rest. It worked about 60% of the time. The other 40% required someone to stay at the helm. Tomasz watched the names scroll and knew which ones were staying. The Vreth picket line at Heron Station detected the first wave at extreme range. 6 civilian contacts inbound on non-standard approach vectors. The duty officer, a third caste tactical monitor, flagged them and requested instructions from the fleet commander. The request traveled up the authorization chain. 4 minutes for the first acknowledgement. 6 more for a targeting decision. By the time the order came back, 2 of the freighters had already reached detonation range. The first ship, the courier Pelin, hit the station's fuel transfer arm and blew it clean off the structure. The blast wave rippled through the docking ring. Fuel lines ruptured. Secondary fire spread through 3 sections before suppression systems engaged. The second ship, a mining shuttle with no name, just a registration number, detonated against the station's communications array. The array disintegrated. Heron Station went dark on every Vreth command frequency simultaneously. 4 more freighters were still inbound. The Vreth corvettes guarding the station opened fire. They hit 2. Both were weapon ships. The detonations happened short of the target, but still threw shrapnel clouds across the station's orbital zone, shredding sensor equipment and docking clamps. The remaining 2 freighters reached the station's main hull. Both detonated. Heron Station broke apart in a slow, grinding collapse that took 11 minutes, each section folding into the next as structural supports failed in sequence. 1 Vreth installation down, 30 minutes into market day. Across the Vreth-held systems, the reports came in cascading. Kessler System, 3 freighters hit the orbital munitions depot. 2 reached the target. The depot's magazine cooked off, and the blast was visible from the planet's surface. Marin 4. 4 ships targeted the staging platform that the Vreth had built over the same corridor where the convoy massacre happened. The lead ship was intercepted and destroyed at range. The second was hit, but continued on a ballistic trajectory and detonated against the platform's lower docking structure. The third and fourth reached the upper ring. The platform split in half. Tasana, a replacement supply hub, hastily constructed after Vassaro's strike weeks earlier, took 2 freighters simultaneously from opposite approach vectors. The Vreth patrol screen caught 1. The other came in behind a cluster of actual refugee ships that were transiting the system on a legitimate convoy route. The corvette guarding that sector hesitated. Civilian contacts mixed with the weapon ship, clean firing lane, or 1,100 refugees. The corvette didn't fire. The freighter reached the hub and detonated. The refugee ships survived. They'd been warned by the network to hold course and not deviate. They flew through the blast debris with their hulls rattling and their passengers screaming, and they came out the other side alive because the weapon ship's pilot had plotted a detonation point 30 kilometers past their formation before he armed the trigger. He'd done the math. He'd made it work. He didn't have a name in the after-action reports. Just a registration number and a note. Volunteer. Corinth Station. No next of kin. Ordinator Savul Thet stood at the tactical display aboard the Symmetry of Purpose and watched his campaign die. 6 systems. Simultaneous strikes. His supply infrastructure was being dismantled by cargo ships. Freighters and mining shuttles and passenger ferries crewed by dock workers and chemists and retired freight inspectors were doing what the human military fleet had failed to do in 6 months of conventional war. His faceted eyes tracked the damage reports as they populated the display. Red indicators spreading across the map like a rash. Ordinator. His aide, careful. Quiet. Forward fleet reserves are at 41% fuel capacity. Munition stores across the campaign zone are below operational threshold. Without resupply from the Tasana or Heron hubs, both destroyed. Yes, Ordinator. Savul Thet's upper arms moved across the tactical display, pulling data, searching for options. His lower arms were rigid at his sides, locked, clenched. The chitin plates along his forearms raised in a threat posture that was entirely involuntary and directed at nothing. He could not resupply. He could not advance. His patrol screens were overwhelmed. His authorization chains were too slow. His doctrine had no category for what was happening, because what was happening was not supposed to be possible. Civilians did not fight wars. That was the foundational assumption of Vreth strategic doctrine, of the accord of non-combatants, of 600 years of galactic conflict management. Civilians fled. Civilians suffered. Civilians were terrain. They were not combatants. They could not be combatants. The concept was architecturally incompatible with every framework the Vreth used to understand warfare. And yet his campaign was burning. "Pull the fleet back," Savul Thet said. "All forward elements. Consolidate around the primary battle group. Clear the civilian shipping lanes. I want separation between our assets and every human contact, military or civilian. His aide hesitated. "Ordinator, if we abandon the shipping lanes, human-civilian traffic will move freely through." "I know what it means. Execute." The Vreth fleet pulled back. Warships that had spent months nestled inside human convoy formations, sheltered behind human families, now retreated to tight defensive clusters around their remaining assets. They gave up the transit corridors. They gave up the civilian shipping lanes. They gave up the gray zone that had won them every engagement for 6 months. Savul Thet thought he was creating clean firing lanes. Military targets on one side, civilians on the other. Order restored. Geometry corrected. He was wrong. The network saw the withdrawal within hours. Civilian ships moving through the transit corridors reported Vreth warships pulling back, consolidating, clustering. The lanes were open. For the first time since the war began, civilian freighters could move through contested space without Vreth warships breathing on their hulls. Tomasz Brodzik received the reports on the MASSACRE, now positioned in the staging area behind Waystation 11. He read them twice. Then he pulled up the navigation charts for the Vreth Forward Fleet anchorage, the main body of Savul Thet's battle group, now consolidated in a tight formation above the gas giant Dreva 6. The anchorage was where the Vreth fleet lived. Dreadnoughts, carriers, lance cruisers. The warships that had burned through 4 colony worlds and killed 11,000 people in the Marin 4 corridor. All of them now pulled together in one place, surrounded by clean space, with clear firing lanes in every direction. Clean firing lanes that worked both ways. Tomasz keyed the network frequency. "This is MASSACRE. I need every converted ship that can reach Dreva within 16 hours. Full payload, mixed formation." The responses came back. 14 ships. "Mixed formation," he repeated. "Weapon ships and clean ships together. Tight spread. I want them guessing." He'd learned the lesson from the Vreth. If you can't tell which ships are dangerous, all of them become dangerous. If you can't fire without risking innocence, you can't fire at all. The Vreth had used human civilians as shields. Tomasz was going to use the same geometry. Weapon ships hidden among clean ships. The Vreth would see 14 contacts inbound and know that some of them were bombs and some of them were bluffs, and they would have no way to tell which was which without killing all of them. Their own tactic. Turned around. Handed back. The formation entered the Dreva system broadcasting on open channels. No stealth. No deception. 14 civilian freighters in a loose spread, heading directly for the Vreth fleet anchorage. Tomasz broadcast on the same open frequency the Vreth had used to ignore every convoy they'd sheltered behind for 6 months. "Vreth fleet anchorage. This is the civilian vessel MASSACRE and associated formation. We are transiting this space under the accord of non-combatants. We are unarmed civilian ships exercising freedom of navigation in a shared corridor." The same words, the same legal framework, the same gray zone. On the symmetry of purpose, Savul Thet heard the transmission and understood immediately what was happening. His clicking rose to a frequency that made his aide step back. "They're using our doctrine. Ordinator, should we fire?" 14 contacts on the display. Savul Thet could destroy all 14 and guarantee the weapon ships died. He would also kill the crews of the clean ships, unarmed civilians exercising freedom of navigation. He would become the thing the Accord was built to prevent. On an open channel, with the entire galaxy listening. Or he could hold fire and let the formation through, and gamble that his point defense systems could intercept the weapon ships once they broke formation and accelerated toward the anchorage. But point defense was designed for missiles and strike craft, not freighters. The targeting algorithms didn't know how to classify a bulk hauler as an incoming threat. "Ordinator?" Savul Thet hesitated. 3 seconds. 5. The formation was closing. "All batteries, target the formation. Fire!" The Vreth fleet opened up. Plasma lances and point defense batteries filled the space between the anchorage and the incoming freighters with a wall of energy and metal. 6 freighters died in the first salvo. 3 were clean ships, empty hulls, skeleton crews, unarmed. 3 were weapon ships that detonated short of the anchorage, throwing shrapnel clouds across the Vreth formation, but causing only superficial damage. 8 freighters remained. They scattered. The clean ships broke high and low, pulling Vreth fire away from the center. The weapon ships drove straight in. 2 more weapon ships were hit and detonated, close enough now that the blasts rocked the outer screening vessels. A Vreth destroyer lost its sensor array. A corvette took shrapnel through its engine housing and went dark. The MASSACRE drove through the center of the formation. Tomasz was not aboard. He'd transferred to a clean ship at the staging area and handed the MASSACRE to an autopilot rig built by a mining engineer from Pellis Station. The rig was simple: hold course, maintain speed, detonate on proximity. The MASSACRE hit the anchorage's central fuel depot at full thrust. The hold, packed with every cubic meter of compressed hydrogen, methane, and fluorine compound that Corinth Station could provide, surrounded by 3 tons of scrap metal from the wreckage of the Marin 4 convoy, detonated in a blast that whited out sensor displays across the system. The fuel depot went first. Then the munitions barges tethered to it. Then the chain reaction reached the fuel lines connecting the depot to the dreadnoughts and carriers anchored around it. Secondary explosions rippled through the anchorage for 9 minutes. 2 dreadnoughts broke apart. A carrier lost its entire port side. The Symmetry of Purpose took a shrapnel wave that breached 3 decks and killed 40 crew members on the command level. Savul Thit was thrown from his station. He hit the deck with 4 limbs and felt the ship shudder around him in a way that warships were not supposed to shudder. Alarms, atmosphere warnings. The tactical display was dead. When auxiliary power restored it 30 seconds later, the anchorage was gone. The fleet that had conquered 4 human worlds in 3 months was crippled, scattered, and burning. Savul Thet stood in the wreckage of his command deck and looked at the display. Blue dots, the surviving civilian freighters, were pulling away, heading back toward human space. Clean ships, unarmed. The weapon ships had done their work, and the bluffs had drawn his fire, and the whole thing had been built on a geometry he had invented and used against human families for 6 months. His aide, bleeding from a gash across his upper thorax, said, "Ordinator, what are your orders?" Savul Thet said nothing. His clicking had stopped completely. The silence from a Vreth commander was louder than any sound his species could make. Tomasz Brodzik stood on the bridge of the freighter Oksa, a borrowed ship, small, barely functional. He was burned. His left hand was wrapped in emergency dressing from a steam rupture while loading the MASSACRE during the staging chaos. He hadn't slept in 2 days. He looked like what he was, a dock worker who had stumbled into a war and fought it with the only things he had. The network reports came in. The anchorage was destroyed. The Vreth fleet was crippled. The forward campaign was over. Across 6 systems, every major Vreth supply installation had been hit. The Dominion's logistics backbone was shattered. The cost scrolled alongside the victory. 19 weapon ships lost in the day's strikes. 14 suicide runs. Crews who stayed at the helm because the autopilot rigs failed, or the approach required manual correction, or they simply chose not to leave. 5 clean ships destroyed by Vreth fire during the Dreva assault. 31 total ships launched at the start of Market Day. 12 survived. Tomasz read the names. He knew most of them. Vasaro was already gone from weeks ago. Now Gruber. Dahl, the chemist from Corinth, who'd volunteered for a suicide run at Kessler because he said his hands were getting too shaky for precise chemical work, and he wanted to be useful one more time. The young engineer from Corinth with no next of kin. A freight captain whose name Tomasz couldn't remember, but whose handshake he could still feel. He set down the communicator. He stood in the bridge of the Oxa and looked at the viewport. Stars, debris, the distant glow of something still burning near Dreva 6. Then he reached for the open channel transmitter. Galactic broadcast, every frequency, every species, every station and ship and colony and council chamber with a receiver tuned to open comms. He keyed the transmitter and spoke. "This is Tomasz Brodzik, civilian, freight hauler, registration number Maser 7714, out of Marin 4. He paused. Not for effect, because his voice almost broke and he wasn't going to let it. 6 months ago, your Accord told us our dead were unfortunate. Your council told us that the ships hiding behind our families were exercising freedom of navigation. Your rules told us to sit down and wait for justice from institutions that don't know what the word means." He looked at his bandaged hand, at the burn marks on the console, at the names on the communicator screen. "We're not soldiers. We're dock workers and chemists and freight haulers and miners. We build things. That's what we do. You made us build something else." His voice was flat, tired. The voice of a man who would carry the names of the dead for the rest of his life, and who was not asking for sympathy, permission, or forgiveness. "You made this personal. Welcome to human war. No spectators. No mercy." He released the transmitter. The bridge was quiet. The stars didn't move. Somewhere behind him, the wreckage of the Vreth anchorage drifted and cooled and joined the debris of everything the war had consumed. On the observation station, GAC observer Divan sat at his console and listened to the broadcast. His translucent skin cycled through every color the Tessari body could produce: amber, violet, white, deep red, colors that had no names in any language he spoke, and then went still, clear, like glass. He opened his file. Observations on the collapse of the non-combatant doctrine. He added one final entry. The Accord assumed the line between civilian and combatant was natural. It was not. It existed only because species chose to respect it. The Vreth erased that line when they hid behind civilians. Humanity has now erased what remained of it. I do not believe the galaxy will see it again. He saved the file. He closed the console. He sat in the dark and did not move for a long time.
Hey there, space human. I'm really curious about your thoughts on this video. Drop a quick comment and let me know what's on your mind. Or just say hi if you prefer. Either way, I'd love to hear from you. Also, remember to check the pinned comment. Trust me, it's worth a look. Oh, and one last thing. I've chosen another video for you to watch. Just click the card here, or here if you want the whole playlist. See you there.